Snow fell like ash that morning, slow and silent, cloaking the town of whispering pines in a fragile hush. The station sat at the edge of the world, or so it seemed, where the rails vanished into white infinity, and time itself hesitated before moving forward. The first whistle of dawn came low and mournful, drifting over the empty platform like the sigh of something ancient, and through that haze of winter breath, she appeared. A mother dog, ribs showing beneath her storm-gray fur, trudged along the frozen tracks. In her mouth she carried a flannel bundle, faded red and heavy with purpose. Each step left a trembling mark in the snow before being swallowed by the storm. She was not running. She was not lost. She was returning, though only she seemed to know to what. Officer Silas Morrow watched her from the edge of the platform. He had been sweeping the frost from the rails, his breath clouding in the dim light. The sight of her, that quiet persistence, the weight of something fragile clutched between her teeth, rooted him in place. He had seen men break on these same tracks, crushed by despair, but never had sorrow walk so plainly on four legs. When she reached the bench by the waiting room, she stopped. Her paws trembled. The bundle dropped to the planks with a soft thud. Then she curled herself around it, tail flicking snow over the flannel as if to protect it from the cold. Silas approached slowly, his boots whispering against the frost. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice low, the kind of tone used for broken things, or ghosts. The dog's eyes lifted, and in them, he saw something human, exhaustion so deep it looked like faith. He crouched, removing one glove to touch the edge of the cloth. It was stiff with frost, and beneath it the faint outline of something small. When he unfolded it, the air caught in his throat. Inside lay a pup, motionless. Its fur was the color of milk, a tiny tongue pressed against frozen air. He waited for breath that never came. The mother let out a sound, not a bark, not a whine, but a hollow moan that cracked through the stillness. Silas felt something ancient and unnameable stir in his chest. He lifted his gaze toward the town, where smoke rose from chimneys and voices carried faintly through the wind. "Who'd do this?" he muttered, though he knew no one was listening. The station had been his post for 12 years, long enough to know people often turned away from what reminded them of pain. By mid-morning, a few townsfolk gathered, drawn by curiosity more than compassion. They stood beneath the eaves, whispering. "Stray again," said the butcher's wife. "They breed under the lumber mill." "Filthy things," another added. "Should have stayed gone." Silas turned toward them, his expression unreadable. "You'll go home now," he said softly, but his voice carried the weight of command. The crowd thinned, grumbling into the snow. When they were gone, he knelt again, lifting the flannel bundle and the trembling mother into his coat. "Come on, girl, let's get you warm." Inside the station, the old stove coughed out its thin heat. The room smelled of iron, oil, and damp wool. Silas laid the bundle beside the fire and gently set the dog down. Her eyes followed every movement, filled with a fragile trust he didn't deserve. He added coal to the stove until the metal glowed. The flannel caught his attention again, the pattern of faded checks, frayed at the edges and along one corner, delicate embroidery in red thread. C.W. The letters tugged at a memory. Clara Wynne, the seamstress who lived near the tracks, the woman who hadn't smiled since the accident last winter, when her husband's train never made it through the storm. Silas remembered the look on her face that night, the lantern trembling in her hand as they brought her his pocket watch, twisted and blackened. She had sewn quilts for the town's children ever since, stitching sorrow into quiet usefulness. He stared at the initials again, and the dog's gaze followed his, as though confirming what he already knew. That evening, Silas wrapped the flannel around the lifeless pup and carried it through the falling snow. The wind howled against the lamplight, carrying the scent of iron and pine. Clara's cottage sat just beyond the switchyard, its windows glowing faintly through the storm. When she opened the door, the sight of him, uniform dusted white, expression somber, made her still. Her hands, stained with thread and dye, clutched the frame as if bracing for news she could not bear twice. He held out the flannel silently. "This was found at the station." Her eyes went to the fabric. Recognition flared. "That's," her voice caught, "that was my husband's shirt, the one I used to patch his coat." She reached out, tracing the initials with trembling fingers. "Where did you find it?" "With her," he said. "A dog carried it in her mouth." Clara frowned, confused, until realization washed over her. "Bryn," she whispered. "That was our dog. She disappeared after he died." Her voice grew smaller with each word, fading like smoke. "She came back, Silas said quietly. Clara pressed the cloth to her chest, and for a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind filled the silence between them, carrying something gentle beneath its cold. The ache of recognition. "May I see her?" she asked finally. He nodded. Together they returned to the station, the lantern swaying between them. When Clara entered, Bryn lifted her head weakly. For an instant her ears perked, a flicker of memory, of a home that once smelled like bread and warmth. Clara knelt beside her, whispering, "You remember me, don't you?" The dog pressed her muzzle into Clara's palm, trembling. It was not joy, but something quieter. Relief, perhaps, or forgiveness. Silas turned away to stoke the fire, giving them space. The station felt less hollow with them there. The shadows softened. Even the ticking clock seemed to slow its measured sorrow. Hours passed. Clara removed her shawl and wrapped it around Bryn. She hummed under her breath, the tune rough from disuse. Silas listened from the bench, his eyes heavy. The melody stirred a half-memory. His mother's lullabies, the sound of trains passing far away. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. When the clock struck midnight, Bryn finally ate. Just a few bites, enough to break the stillness. Clara exhaled, her lips curving into something that might one day become a smile. "She's learning to live again," she said softly. Silas looked up. "Aren't we all?" Their eyes met, tired, scarred, and seen. Words weren't needed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but it no longer felt cruel. Later, after Clara had gone home to fetch more food, Silas sat by the fire. Bryn slept near his boots, her paw resting over the folded flannel. The pup's shape beneath it had grown still, yet something about the scene, the peace in it, felt almost holy. He thought of Clara's quiet strength, of the dog's relentless journey, of how grief can circle back like a train on old tracks, returning to the same station until someone finally meets it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and murmured, "You did what you could, girl." "That's more than most." Bryn stirred, her tail twitching once in her sleep, as if she'd heard. Beyond the windows, dawn crept through the storm. The light touched the frost on the glass, turning it to fire. The station was still, save for the sound of breathing, one man, one dog, and the faint whisper of the flannel shifting in the heat. It was the kind of morning that asked for silence, and yet, somewhere deep inside him, something small began to thaw. He rose and opened the door, letting in the pale blue of early day. The world was still buried in snow, but it no longer felt endless. For the first time in years, he wanted to see what came after. Behind him, Bryn lifted her head, watching. Her eyes reflected the light, bright and knowing. The old rails shimmered beyond the threshold, vanishing into white mist. The narrator's voice, soft and worn, would one day remember it this way, that love sometimes returns not to be recognized, but to remind us of the courage it takes to keep walking. Silas closed the door gently, the warmth of the stove breathing behind him. Bryn settled once more beside the flannel, the faintest sigh leaving her body, content, safe, for now. Outside, the wind carried whispers along the rails, stories waiting to be told. And deep within the station, a promise lingered. This was not the end, only the beginning of something that still had the power to heal. The snow did not stop. Days folded into one another, white upon white, until time itself seemed to dissolve. The station became a haven of small routines. The hiss of boiling water, the scratch of Clara's needle, the soft thud of Bryn's paws pacing before the stove. Silas had grown used to the quiet presence of them both, their shadows swaying with the firelight. It was a fragile kind of peace, the sort one doesn't dare name aloud for fear of losing it. Each morning before the first train arrived, Bryn carried the flannel bundle to the platform. She would sit facing the northbound tracks, the wind pressing her ears back, eyes fixed on the distance. No command or coaxing could make her stay inside. Clara said nothing, only watched with that hollow patience of someone who understood waiting too well. Silas began to wonder what memory pulled the dog there, what echo she chased through the storm. It was near dusk when Clara spoke of it. She was mending a torn sleeve by the stove, her fingers moving slower than usual. "Before he died," she said, voice soft, "Elias and I were expecting. It was early, and I hadn't told anyone but him. Then the derailment happened, and afterward, it was gone." She paused, the thread trembling between her fingers. "Sometimes I still wake thinking I hear a baby crying. But it's only the wind." Silas didn't answer. The words filled the room with a sorrow too fragile to touch. He only nodded, staring into the fire until the colors blurred. Bryn shifted beside him, her head lifting as if she sensed the ache that hung in the air. When Clara finally met his eyes, she gave a small, weary smile. Strange, isn't it? How the heart remembers things the body forgets. That night, the storm returned with teeth. The windows rattled, the lanterns swayed. Silas locked the doors and fed the stove, but the cold still found its way in, sharp as glass. Bryn grew restless, pacing, whining softly. Then, without warning, she darted toward the door. Her claws scraped the wood. Easy, Silas said, rising. But she didn't stop. She scratched harder, frantic, eyes wide with something close to terror. Clara stood, clutching her shawl. She's trying to tell us something. The moment Silas unlatched the door, Bryn burst into the blizzard, vanishing into white. Silas hesitated only a second before grabbing his lantern and coat. "Stay here," he said, though he knew Clara wouldn't listen. The snow swallowed his words as he followed the paw prints down the track. The wind screamed against his face. He could barely see beyond the trembling circle of light. Bryn's trail wove between the rails, leading north, toward the edge of the forest. He called her name, but the storm devoured his voice. When he found her, she was standing still beneath a black oak, fur rimed with frost, tail stiff. The flannel bundle lay before her, half buried in snow. For a moment, he thought she'd gone mad, dragging it out again to mourn what was gone. But then he heard it, faint, almost impossible, a sound thinner than breath, a whimper. He dropped to his knees, heart thundering. Beneath the flannel, something moved, small, fragile, alive. A pup, its fur damp, its body trembling with the effort of living. Bryn licked its face desperately, whining. "Dear God," Silas whispered. He wrapped both dog and pup in his coat and turned back toward the station. The wind fought him every step, cutting through the layers, but he ran, the lantern swinging wildly, the snow stinging his eyes. When he stumbled through the station door, Clara gasped. "What?" He laid the bundle beside the fire. The pup was still breathing, barely. Bryn collapsed beside it, chest heaving. Clara dropped to her knees, cupping the tiny creature in her hands. Her tears fell onto its fur, melting the frost. "Come on, little one," she whispered, voice breaking. "Come back to us." The room was a fragile world of sound. The crackle of the fire, the soft whimper of the pup, the rasp of Clara's breathing. Silas stood motionless, helpless, watching as life trembled on a thread. Then, like a miracle too small for angels, the pup gave a cry, sharp, defiant. Clara laughed through her tears, holding it close. "He's alive." Bryn watched, her eyes dull with exhaustion. But there was peace there too. The peace of something finished. She lowered her head, resting it near Clara's knee, and exhaled softly, as if surrendering. Silas reached out to stroke her fur, but even as his fingers brushed it, he felt the stillness settle. One moment she was breathing, the next she was not. Clara's laughter turned into quiet sobs. Silas lowered his head, whispering. She just wanted someone to find what she couldn't protect. The fire burned low, its light trembling across the floor. Outside, the wind howled and then softened, as if paying its respects. Silas placed his coat over the dog's body. The pup stirred in Clara's arms, and in that motion, he saw the cruel mercy of the world. How death and life always arrived hand in hand. Morning came pale and quiet. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of muted blue. Silas dug a small grave behind the station, beneath the oak where the first prints had appeared days ago. Clara stood beside him, holding the pup wrapped in the flannel. Neither spoke. When the last handful of snow fell over Bryn's resting place, Clara whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know whether she meant him or the dog, or the universe that had finally allowed something to end gently. Perhaps it was all the same. The days that followed carried a strange stillness. The station, once only a place of departure, began to feel like a home. The pup, they named him Flannel, grew quickly, his fur thick and warm, eyes bright as amber. He slept near the stove, curled against the same coat that had once carried him through the storm. Clara visited daily at first, then began staying longer. She helped sweep the floors, brewed tea, mended Silas's old gloves. Sometimes they talked, about small things, weather and rails and trains, and sometimes they didn't. It was the quiet that bound them more than words, the sense that they were both learning to live in a world that no longer hurt as much. The town's gossip softened over time. Where once there had been whispers of pity or suspicion, now there was simple curiosity. "Have you seen the station lately?" Someone would ask at the bakery. "That dog they found, her pup's still there. Officer Morrow and the seamstress are raising it together." And always, the listener would smile, warmed by the idea of it. Winter began to fade. The snow receded from the tracks, revealing steel that gleamed like memory. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Silas and Clara stood outside the station watching the light turn gold against the windows. Flannel bounded between them, chasing shadows. "He looks like her," Clara said softly. Silas nodded. "Same eyes." For a long moment they said nothing more. Then Clara turned to him, her face touched by the last amber of the day. "You ever wonder," she asked, "why she came back here?" "Why now?" Silas considered this. "Maybe she remembered the way home. Or maybe," he said, voice low, "she wanted to remind us that it's still possible to find one." Clara smiled, and the expression reached her eyes. The first true light he'd seen in them. "Then I suppose she did." Night settled slowly, stars trembling above the frozen pines. Inside the station, the fire burned steady. Flannel slept in a woven basket near the hearth, one paw twitching in dream. Silas sat by the window watching the snow begin again. Soft, unthreatening. Clara poured 2 cups of tea, her movements unhurried. When she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. The silence between them was full, not empty. He looked toward the sleeping pup and said quietly, "You think he knows?" Clara tilted her head. "Knows what?" "That he was carried here by love." Her eyes softened. "I think that's the only thing he knows." Outside, a train passed, slow, distant, its lights gliding across the snow like memories on rails. For the first time, its whistle didn't sound mournful. It sounded like promise. The narrator's voice, aged and tender, would recall it later as one recalls a dream that refused to fade. That winter at Whispering Pines, when a dog's devotion stitched together 3 broken lives, love did not return as thunder or fire. It came quietly, like the slow thaw of ice. A bowl left by the door, a lamp lit before dusk, a name whispered not to be remembered, but to be forgiven. In the end, Bryn had carried more than a bundle. She had carried them all toward the edge of grief, showing them how to cross without drowning. Silas glanced once more toward the rails, silver under moonlight, and felt something within him loosen, like frost breaking under sunlight. The world, for all its cruelty, still held a pulse. He turned back to Clara, who sat beside the fire with Flannel in her lap, humming softly. The same lullaby she'd once sung to the dog. The station smelled of tea and coal and faint traces of life renewed. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the snow gentle, Silas swore he could hear a soft rustle beyond the window, the sound of paws brushing across the platform, fading toward the tracks. He never went to look. Some spirits, he knew, deserved to keep walking. The story ends not with farewell, but with continuation. A warmth that lingers even after the final page. And as the old voice fades, it leaves behind one truth, simple and eternal. Even the smallest act of love, a shelter from the cold, a hand outstretched, a name remembered, can carry a soul home. If this whisper found your heart, stay a while. Listen for the next tale that rides upon the wind, where every loss hides a seed of mercy. Whispered tales will find you again, just beyond the rails.